Welcome to Shutter and Flow. Today, we're going to kick off a little series that we're going to do on all things back-end post-production, and as well as dive into a lot of topics, including file management, color spaces, raw file types, things that might be interesting to some photographers. It's something that everyone needs to know a little bit about. We're not going to dive super deep into it, but we're going to touch on a lot of topics. And as part of this, we're also going to bring on a digital tech that's currently working in Atlanta and gets a lot of work. So we're going to ask him a bunch of questions. And we thought we would actually start this off by Jeremy interviewing me a little bit, since that is my background.
Yeah. So, I guess where to start? We went to school together. That's obvious. We both went to the Art Institute. And then I started at Turner Broadcasting at some point, and there was a job opening for a digital artist at the time. What was the actual title at the time?
DSP, digital shoot processing. So it wasn't even a retoucher position. It was a digital shoot processing position, which they really don't have anymore anywhere, I don't think.
No, that is an interesting thing. A quick aside to start with that. This is a good base level. Where we used to work was one of the early corporations to convert to digital and backing everything up properly and having servers and all of that to go from film to that. Obviously, before we were there, but they had early processes for that most places did not have a back-end system to store everything and easy access for clients, internal clients, but either way. So at that time, your job was basically let's go with it. You were taking what we shot, what was shot, processing it, converting it into JPEGs, all the different things that were needed for different formats, and uploading it. Is that roughly how you would describe it?
Yeah, exactly. Basically taking raw files and color correcting everything. At the time, we were doing everything in ACR or in Bridge, right? And ACR is Adobe Camera Raw. So you'll probably hear me mention ACR quite a bit once we start diving into actual processing and color spaces. But we would take all of the shoots, process everything out so that color looked consistent and correct across it. It was very specific for networks. So for CNN, we could only do so many things. You could only touch so many sliders and things, because it was, especially if it was for editorial, not like key art shoot. And then for unit, we would go a little bit further. You would basically get the raw file to a workable place where then they could go in, make selects, and then the selects would go on to the next stage, which was basically base retouching. And aside from just doing the actual color work, we would sometimes double check for some sort of input metadatas on the front end. But then our DAM system team would handle the metadata on the back end, and we would process out multiple file types for all of those raw files. And depending on, typically everyone was shooting Canon at the time, except for one photographer was shooting Nikon. Most of it would still run through ACR without any problems. And then we would work on early versions of Capture One, to process out key art shoots in Capture, which is how I started digital teching, was because I was the only person that was learning Capture One on the post team there, and also started retouching as a retoucher. So I kind of went from the first few months I was just doing DSP to quickly starting to do retouching as well, because that was my background in school. That's kind of how I got the job, was my portfolio as a retoucher, and ended up kind of wearing three hats really early on in my career, which was digital teching, retouching, and digital shoot processing, and quickly kind of moved away from DSP just to retouching and then digital teching on the larger key art shoots that we were doing. And that was my first job out of college.
Yeah, and I don't even think the digital processing is a job anywhere at this point for any company. I feel like it is just most photographers are digital techs, handle all of that and upload it. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. So then
it's easier now, and
yeah.
the software's better and faster. And so it's a lot easier to do now than it was when things were clunkier.
Yeah. So then you moved into more solid retouching full time. And what all did that entail? Because it was across the board. We had so many different things we would shoot. And what are some of the craziest things you touched besides Eric Andre?
Yeah. Yeah, we won't talk about that one. So I started retouching key art probably a couple of years before I left Turner and was doing the high end key art composites as well as the other people on the post team were doing the same thing. And, got a chance to really work on some cool stuff. It was fun. I think one time you and I went to New York to cover some event and was around Times Square and saw a CNN billboard with some work I had on it and a TBS or TNT one that had some of my work on it. And it was just, you kind of hit that level where you're working on the higher end stuff for a big network. It's really cool to actually work on things where you're driving around and see the work. You've had the same experience where for you, especially like you've shot a lot of key art where you're driving around Atlanta or you go to New York to visit or LA and you'll see something that you shot on a billboard. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, it's exciting to actually see things out in the world on that scale. And it's always, I feel like it's always going to be exciting. If it's not, there's a problem.
Yeah,
Even unless you hate the photo for some reason, which does happen
100%.
because sometimes you shoot it and don't have control. So then at some point you decided to leave Atlanta, move away, and to get married and all that stuff. So
Yeah,
where
it
did you
happens.
do after that? What was your next role?
So I went freelance for a couple of years after I left Turner, and I worked primarily in DC. I lived in DC for a while and worked for a lot of photographers there. And I was digital teching a lot. And I was doing some amount of retouching, but I actually was digital teching on a lot of shoots. I was the only person digital teching in DC. When I moved there, I met a lot of photographers and realized that some of them have heard of a digital tech at the time. They'd never worked with one. They didn't really know what a digital tech did. So I became the go-to person. People would come in from out of town and call photographers looking for a digital tech. And so that's what I ended up doing while I lived in DC for a couple of years because people just needed a digital tech and there wasn't one there. I actually trained an assistant or two there or kind of helped them to become digital techs in DC because there was a need for it and people weren't doing it. So it's weird. I kind of went from doing really high end retouching, kind of taking a step laterally and doing more of the digital tech work, but was still doing retouching on the side for sure. And after that, moved to LA. Kind of same thing in LA. In LA, I was a cross between an on-site digital tech for a couple of companies and doing some retouching, and then ended up moving to San Francisco, which is really where I went in-house for a long time, back to going in-house. So I worked for a small company in San Francisco that had a ton of retouching work and basically ended up working on everything from fashion and e-commerce stuff to a lot of tech projects. And this was the first time I really worked on tech projects. So very different than entertainment key art. Worked on a lot of stuff for Google and eBay and across the board. I don't know, name a tech company. I've probably done something for them at some point. And also was doing a lot of print work. We had a couple of catalog clients. So got my hands really deep into the work and really deep into the weeds on doing a lot of print production stuff, which I had never really done before at the time. After a few years of that, I feel like I got pretty good at doing print work. And that's actually where you're doing press checks and you are actually really dialing in color. Because if you're not doing really high end print work, especially for like catalogs or companies that really care about what their clothing looks like in print and on web, you're not really typically worried about color that much. But as soon as you get to that point, you're really dealing in a lot of color. And then working on the other side, working on some of the tech stuff, they didn't care about color that much, but they want their products to be perfect. So doing a lot of really intricate composite work. And at that point, I'd started to move up and was actually training lower level retouchers, starting to manage. So by the time I left that company, I was running the post team here and there. And so that led me to the next job, which was LA. I was a post production manager at Accenture. It used to be called Creative Drive. Accenture acquired them when I was there. And my biggest client was Lululemon. I ran a pretty big post-production team there, handling not just Lululemon, but a bunch of other clients, Vans and Wilson, and I don't know, couple others. And that was a beast of a job. I was working 10-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week. And I think when I started there, I worked for 3 months straight without a day off. My first day off was a Saturday. So it was a kind of a crazy job, but I learned a lot. And that was a job where I learned a lot of back end stuff because I was constantly either on set having conversations with the techs or the photographers, constantly an intermediary between the clients and what the clients wanted, their expectations of the work, and managing the workflow with the team.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize on that type of stuff, like a Lululemon, one shirt, you go on the website and there's what, 5 different images of the same shirt that all have to match perfectly. And in a given day, how many different articles of clothing do you think in a given day they were shooting in the studio that have to all be organized, cataloged, sorted to the back end to make sure they all stay
Yeah, it
together? And
was it
it's
was kind of dependent on the week, but I would say that roughly my team got through somewhere around 1,000 to 2,000 images a week. So, and that was 52 weeks a year. I mean, we were closed every now and then for holidays, but other than that, it was go, go, go. There wasn't a lot of downtime. And then when we weren't just shooting Lulu, there was also like more seasonal shoots for companies that weren't shooting as much. So Vans is a good example. Vans still shot thousands and thousands of images, and every type or article of clothing had a totally different workflow. We did some outsourcing for certain things and then handled a lot of things in house. And so it was just this, it was a logistical nightmare sometimes. And the company had built these amazing pieces of software, platforms, if you want to call it that, to handle all this stuff. But it was a job in which I wasn't really a retoucher. I was more expected to manage the team and people working on it, and really was constantly managing the client, their expectations, making sure things got from point A to point B to point C to final delivery, working with SOPs, making sure that everything was actually being done correctly, and constantly just jumping in to put out fires. I mean, that job was really, you're just a firefighter. You are constantly every day trying to make sure that the train stays on the tracks.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially just a giant wave that's always coming. It
Yeah.
never stops. Like when
Yeah,
you're
I
dealing with
was
companies that big, there's just nonstop things that have to be produced and put out, and assets have to go, and there's no way to stop it.
Yep. And that job gave me a lot of opportunities. I started training other post-production managers. I worked with people in London, people in Atlanta and Florida, and then our other office in San Francisco, being on the same time zone, was their main client was North Face at the time, and it was supporting all these different studios. And then New York was the biggest one, and so sometimes we would kind of support some things for them. So had a chance to pretty much work on a ton of different fashion brands. And it wasn't just e-commerce. E-commerce was the bulk of it, but it also started doing some editorial, started doing some marketing pieces, things like that. We won some more work from Lululemon based off of our relationship with them. And by the time I left, we had transitioned one of our retouchers to be full-time just doing their marketing promo stuff. So it was a big job, kind of cool, got to do a lot of stuff. And that kind of landed me my last job that I had, which was, I can't name the company, NDAs and whatnot, but think of the biggest tech company you can think of. And I was a content producer there in Silicon Valley for a couple of years. And that job was totally different. I basically saw a different side of things where I was a liaison between design and post-production teams and a couple other teams, and basically got to do a lot of totally different things, but really, really high end. Think of the company, if you could think off the top of your head, that does the highest end marketing work you could possibly think of. That was the company. So
Yeah.
um, it
They gotta,
was a very cool job.
yeah, they have to have that presentation every once in a while to show everyone what's coming, and you got to have a bunch of stuff for that.
Yeah. And if you want to talk about pixel perfect, I've never worked anywhere where you are in a meeting discussing things moving literally 1 or 2 pixels. And just the amount of effort that goes into making sure everything is pixel perfect is crazy. And also dealing with things like localization, which is when there's type written in one language and you basically have to have it localized for every other language in which products are sold. So think worldwide, it becomes a really big undertaking. You get to work with a lot of cool people in different teams, which was really fun. I learned a lot there as well. I would say less that actually applies to the photography world and more as it applies to marketing.
Yeah, it's more project management. Different.
100%.
Yeah, there comes a point where you're not actually doing the physical stuff anymore.
Yeah, but there was some of that involved with working with our post-production team that we had. And the post-production team there, they don't do what you would consider typical traditional retouching. Like a lot of times when you're talking about working on a tech product, there are a lot of things that are involved, right? If there's a screen showing on something, those screens are built separate. They have to be inlaid. And then every single little element on that screen has to be pixel perfect. And then the devices themselves, sometimes they're photographed, sometimes they're a full render, and the renders often are built in Photoshop as vector objects and are massive. You want to talk about a massive file size, start working with a bunch of like vector rendered files that have screens added and stuff. So I did still have my hands a little bit in having to open and do things in Photoshop or QC things, quality control. That was a big part of the last 2 jobs that I had. But at the same time, it's not what you would think of in a traditional photo shoot. I did occasionally talk to post-production people, but in the last role that I had, I barely, if ever, talked to any photographers.
Yeah, because it's normally on that. When you get big enough, it's like you shoot the photographer a lot of times will shoot stuff and hand it off and not even know what happens to it on the back end. Like it's
Yeah.
amazing how often that even happens to me. And you just trust the team that you're working with and your selects and all of that to go. But you also know it's a big enough company and that they want their stuff to look good. So they're going to
You know
make
it's
it
going to
look
look
great.
good. I mean,
Yeah.
you know it's going to look good. I think that's the thing about working for a company like that that has the amount of money to throw at a marketing budget. Any large tech company is going to have a huge amount of money to throw at a marketing budget. Anything coming out of that is going to look great because they're going to spend the money on it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that's your background. Now let's dig into just some like top level best practices people should think about when they're going out to shoot stuff. As a photographer, what makes it easier on the back end for if you're working with a team, if you're working with a designated retoucher, if you're working with all that, what are the things that they should think about when they're going out to shoot?
So I want to split this up into kind of 2 different kinds of shoots. We'll split it up into tethered and untethered because when you are not shooting tethered and you are just shooting with a camera, shooting to card, you are a little more limited as far as during the shoot, what can be done to those files themselves. I would say, depending on what kind of photography you're shooting, that sometimes you may want to consider if you know that there's going to be a composite, you know there's going to be a high amount of retouching or post-production done in the process, you may want to consider testing out shooting tethered even on location so that you can ensure that you're getting exactly what you need for post-production. So, and we can talk about maybe in another episode or when we talk about shooting tethered with the digital tech. That's why digital techs exist. We can talk about that later. But I would say some of the big ones are making sure you're not shooting JPEGs only if your intent is for any amount of post-production work to be done on the files. Just shoot raw. Pretty simple. Sounds simple, not always followed. And then also you want to think about the best file that you get out of camera is going to be the best file for post-production. So there's kind of this common thread where it's fix it in post. And I know shoots are chaotic. I've been on a ton of shoots. I know a lot of times you just say, hey, we're going to handle this in post because we can't quite get it right now. But always remember that if out of camera, it looks great, after post-production, it's going to look amazing. If out of camera, it looks passable and okay, in post-production, they can try to make it great. But you can only take things so far. So if things are completely blocked out or underlit to an extent where you have to open it up, depending on the type of raw file, you may only be able to bring so much back into it. If you're assuming that you need to crop in aggressively to pull an element from something, then a lot of times you're going to have to upres that element if you have to crop in too much, and it might not match. So I would say my biggest suggestion is to try and understand what the final piece is going to look like and shoot for the final piece. Don't shoot just the way you would normally shoot if you're not going to have any kind of compositing or heavy post done to it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, especially underexposure, blacks that are just, there's no information in it. Those always look terrible when you try to bring them back. And I see it all the time that people try to do it, and it just doesn't work.
And color, right? Think about colors. So shoot color cards. It's the easiest way to make sure that you're going to get a nice, neutral, perfect color when you process the files. If those are, regardless of where those are processed out, if you have a color card, you can always push the color in other directions, but at least this way you're making sure that everything's calibrated.
Yeah, I think it's always best to start with neutral color for your, we'll call it your raw image, your negative, and then you can just do whatever you want with it to give it. Everyone likes to give their treatment now and give their style and do whatever they want to do. But if you're starting with a flat, simple, straightforward file, you know it's all there and you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. Flat, right? You think when you shoot that you want to have interesting lighting in the shot itself. And that is the case with certain types of photography. Let's say you're shooting editorial or something like that, or sports or something else. If that file does have a lot of contrast in it, or the way that you're shooting, maybe the lights are blown out a little bit, that's fine. But if you're shooting for commercial work and you want to make sure that you have the option to not blow out the highlights or the option to not completely black out the darks, shooting a little flatter is actually better for post-production. It gives you more options on the back end to change things.
And that's where I think for people who haven't done tethering and don't shoot tethered, there's such an advantage there because you can, in Capture One or whatever software you choose, you can still have your flat file, make all your adjustments, and see a preview of what it will look like as it's capturing and coming in, but you don't have to bake that into your actual file.
Exactly.
You're still, it still has the raw file that is all the information, flat and simple, but then you can make your adjustments on top of it.
Exactly. And when it's tethered, you can actually check the values and say, is there detail in the black or the highlights completely blowing out? You can actually go through and double check those things.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, we'll get into digital tech another time, but
yeah,
they're checking your focus and all of the different things.
Focus is a given, right? I think no matter what you're shooting, always make sure you're in focus, because you would be surprised the number of times that in post you're trying to fix the best shot that came off of a shoot, but things are slightly out of focus, and then maybe you have to composite some of it, which means you have to sharpen it. When you over sharpening is one of those things that's just immediately noticeable when something is sharpened.
Yeah. And there's more and more softwares that are out now, Topaz and a few other things, and everyone's building an AI version of sharpening into their thing, but it's still taking something that's not great and trying to fix it. So it's never going to be the same as if you shoot it properly the first time.
Exactly. I mean, look, I have done some work in which you're taking a file that's pretty terrible, right? Blown out highlights. The blacks are just gone completely black, and it's maybe a little out of focus, and like you'd be surprised at some of the starting points. And we get it to a point where you look at it and you're like, that looks pretty good, even with some upresing and some other things, some like selective sharpening. But if that file had just started as a really great clean file to start working on, could have taken it a lot further in the same amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's also, that's a big one too, is if you're spending money to get retouching done and there's a problem, it costs more, because if you're paying hourly or by, however it is, it's going to be more than you would have paid on the front end. So you're losing money in the process.
100%. Everything that you're doing takes time. So, and a really good retoucher is going to know how to automate as much things as possible. They're going to have scripts that they run. They're going to have actions that they've built that they use. They're going to be fast and keeping quality, right? A good retoucher can work fast and keep quality. Bad retouchers will really mess up all your stuff. So, but at the same time, think about that even if a good retoucher can keep consistent quality while working quickly so that things don't balloon out of control in terms of pricing, you still want to give them as good of a starting point as possible. So large files, well lit, nothing out of focus. That's a great starting point. It seems simple, but it's difficult when you're on set, trying to make clients happy. You're trying to get as many different shots as you can as possible. And a lot of times it's easy to cut a corner or forget something. And it's always sometimes that last shot of the day or something that just kind of becomes a, like, let's just get it and move on.
Yeah. And I think also on that, it's like, if you are constantly going to a retoucher and there's issues, eventually I assume they're not going to want to work with you anymore if it's constantly just fixing their problems of the photographer. Unless
Not
they're paying
necessarily.
enough,
I mean, I
if there's
think
enough
that's
money.
well, obviously, if there's enough money in there, not necessarily. I think that any retoucher worth their salt is going to develop a relationship with somebody where they understand what they're looking for and what they want. There's very few people that I've worked with over the years that I've just kind of cut off. My usual thing, if I just don't enjoy working with somebody, or if you're constantly just trying to fix problems that they could have not given you to begin with, is just to be a little less communicative with them or something.
Yeah, it does the job. I'm surprised you're still talking to me sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. So what about, I mean, shooting non-tethered is kind of the same way, and you just have to know that once it comes in, you have to do all the stuff that you would have done when it was tethered, I assume, is the best practice.
Yes. And I will say something, that the files that are coming out of high-end DSLRs now are way better than they used to be. It used to be that if you shot, let's say with a Canon, I don't know, 5D Mark II or something like that, and you were shooting with a little bit of low light or like a higher ISO, the digital grain on those cameras was terrible. And so it took a lot of effort to try to get those files to look great, right? And a lot of that was some tricks in Photoshop, some tricks in ACR for processing, things like that. Sometimes it's kind of almost like upraising the file to get rid of some of the digital grain and the noise, and then calling it digital grain, but really it's just noise. And to just sort of fix those files. Whereas shooting tethered, even from early on, shooting with a digital back, you're getting a huge file to work with. So you're not dealing with those kind of problems. I've noticed that less as cameras have gotten better, but it is still there a little bit, depending on what kind of files are the intended output. If you're shooting for web, let's say, you're going to end up with an sRGB JPEG, right? If you know you're going to end up with a smaller JPEG, it's not even a really high res JPEG, it doesn't really matter as much these days. DSLRs shoot pretty well. The only thing I would pay attention to is shooting in low light, high ISO. That's kind of the biggest thing. But if you're not shooting in those environments, I wouldn't worry about it that much, depending on what you shoot. However, most people that are shooting with DSLRs exclusively don't have an opportunity to ever tether. Sometimes they are shooting in those environments. And so they just need somebody that knows how to handle those on the back end. They just need to make sure they're shooting raw. They need to try to shoot with, not crazy high ISOs. Be a little cognizant of that if they can.
Yeah, spend the money on the lens, so you don't have to. You have that extra f-stop to work on.
Yep.
You don't have to crank your ISO up all the time. Is always going to make things look a little bit better if you're in that scenario. Canon just came out with a 45 millimeter 1.2 that is shockingly cheap. It's not their like high end camera, but all the reviews I've seen for it for the cost, it's exceptional. It's $500 for a 1.2 lens. Everything's getting cheaper on that, and you can get away with stuff. And all of the sensors are getting so much better on the low end, the low light scenario, that but you still have to treat it with respect. And I have seen people try to shoot with like, some of the ISO goes up to like 54,000, and I'm like, well, I don't even know. Like I've messed with it before just to see, and I'm like, I don't even want to try this. It's
I don't understand the point of it, right? It's because I mean, if you're shooting sports and you just need to shoot super fast, like most sports are lit. You don't really need it. Like maybe an event photography. I don't know.
yeah, concerts, but they're bright, and I don't know. There's very few times you need that. I do know people that have worked on TV shows, because film sensors are actually video film sensors. They can get away with even more because
Yeah,
they normally have bigger glass, normally bigger sensors on the higher end reds and things like that. So I do know people that have worked on sets that they're like, I was basically shooting with candlelight and they have to figure it out.
yeah,
And that's where they need the really fast lenses and just know that you have to overshoot a little bit to get the focus and get everything there. But
yeah,
for the most part, it shouldn't be a problem.
yeah. Well, I think we can probably leave this here today. Our next episode, we'll likely jump into and talk to a little bit more about color space, and a little bit more about file types, because that also seems to be some confusion when I've talked to people who don't deal with file types a lot. And then we can kind of just go into some metadata stuff and just kind of dig in a little bit more into some different topics.
Yeah, and then we're going to talk to Sean, a digital tech that is working all the time on all different entertainment stuff or commercial stuff across the board. So he sees it in real time, working with different photographers, different cameras, and what is actually happening in day to day, and what you can do to make that person want to work with you as well. So,
Cool.
all right,
Thanks, everybody.
talk to you soon.